They laughed when he walked in, mocked his suit, questioned his presence, and told him this floor wasn't for his kind. One even asked if he was there to deliver food. But none of them knew the man they were humiliating. The black man they tried to push out of the room was about to change their lives forever. This isn't just another corporate drama. This is what happens when arrogance meets accountability, when prejudice walks straight into power and loses. You're not watching a story about success. You're watching a story about exposure. Stay to the end to see what unfolds when justice walks in wearing the skin they underestimated. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. What do you think happens next? And if you want more real stories that flip the script and shatter expectations, like this video, subscribe, and join the conversation. The revolving doors gave way with a gentle whoosh as Malcolm Reed stepped into the lobby of Callister and Rose Global Headquarters. The morning light filtered through towering glass panels, casting sharp shadows across the sleek marble floor. At a glance, everything about the space screamed wealth and power. Brushed gold trim, black granite pillars, the faint scent of citrus oil cleaner, and the low hum of quiet authority. Malcolm walked in with calm purpose, his steps measured, polished shoes clicking with each stride. His charcoal navy suit was immaculate, tailored to precision, and a slim leather briefcase swung in his left hand. This was the kind of environment he had long since learned to move through with practiced control. But experience had also taught him that control didn't always guarantee respect. As he approached the reception desk, a wide crescent of marble manned by a single employee, he offered a courteous nod and a firm good morning. The receptionist didn't flinch. She didn't glance up. Her acrylic nails continued tapping across the keyboard in a mechanical rhythm. The screen's glow reflected in her glasses, which hid whatever flickered behind her eyes, if anything. Malcolm stood for a moment, waiting. When there was no response, he spoke again, slightly louder. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm here for a 9 a.m. briefing on the 32nd floor." Still nothing. The woman remained silent, expressionless, her eyes locked on the monitor, as if he were simply not there. For a moment, Malcolm considered repeating himself. But before he could, a figure moved from the corner of his eye. A man in a dark security uniform approached, walking with slow, calculated purpose. The badge on his chest read Kinley. He looked to be in his 50s, stocky, pale buzz cut, the kind of man who wore his authority in his walk. Kinley didn't ask any questions. He didn't introduce himself or inquire about Malcolm's purpose. He simply stopped a few feet in front of him and spoke in a tone that was calm but unmistakably commanding. "Sir, deliveries go around the back. This entrance is for corporate personnel only." Malcolm turned to face him, taken slightly aback, not by the words, but by how quickly the assumption had landed. He glanced at his suit, then at the briefcase in his hand. Then he looked back at Kinley. "I'm not here making a delivery," he said evenly. "I'm here for a meeting." Kinley's eyes narrowed slightly, as if the statement required decoding. "This area is restricted," he said, unfazed. "You'll need to exit through the main doors and check in through the vendor entrance." His voice didn't waver. He wasn't asking. Malcolm didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. "My name is Malcolm Reed," he said. "I was invited. 9 o'clock. Executive wing." Still, Kinley didn't blink. "That may be," he said, but the way he said it made it clear that it didn't matter. He pointed toward the revolving doors. "Protocol says deliveries go around back. You'll need to wait there." Malcolm let the silence stretch for a second longer than necessary. His eyes flicked to the receptionist, who still hadn't acknowledged him, hadn't so much as shifted her shoulders. As if the entire interaction weren't happening right in front of her. As if he were invisible. As if this were normal. He looked back at Kinley. The man's hand rested casually on the radio clipped to his belt. The kind of gesture that didn't scream aggression, but hinted at escalation if necessary. Malcolm had been here before, not this exact lobby, but this exact moment, where he wasn't just required to state his business. He was required to justify his presence, as if being black in a suit with a briefcase in a corporate lobby needed further clarification. His grip on the briefcase tightened just slightly, but his voice stayed composed. "Would you like to see the invite?" he asked. "Because I have the email right here." Kinley didn't answer. He just took a slow breath through his nose. Malcolm didn't bother digging for his phone. Not yet. He let the silence hang again. The message was already clear. Behind him, the quiet murmur of lobby activity continued. Heels clicking, elevator dings, murmured conversations. But here in this little corner of the marble cathedral, time had slowed to a still. Malcolm took one step back, then turned slowly toward the leather chairs along the far wall. The vendor waiting area. It wasn't labeled as such, but everyone knew. Everyone always knew. He didn't sit. He didn't need to. Instead, he looked at the watch on his wrist. The receptionist still hadn't looked his way again. The security guard had returned to his post but kept an eye on him, as though he were a package left unattended. Eventually, Malcolm checked his watch again. 8:49. He had exactly 11 minutes until the meeting that, if the memo was correct, would define the direction of Callister and Rowe's next fiscal year. He wasn't just attending the briefing. He was scheduled to lead it. So he straightened his shoulders, walked past the receptionist without a word, and made his way toward the bank of elevators, scanning the directory for the executive wing. As he pressed the call button, a trio of men in slim suits rounded the corner, laughing a little too loudly, coffee cups in hand, lanyards swinging. They slowed slightly as they saw Malcolm standing there, their chatter fading just enough for one of them to lean toward the others and mutter, "Did someone order courier?" The others snickered, not bothering to lower their voices. Malcolm heard it clearly. He turned his head slightly, giving them a look that was cool and unreadable, but he said nothing. One of them, a tall man with ginger hair and a smug grin, took a step closer and asked in mock concern, "Hey, you lost, man? This floor's for senior management." His tone dripped with faux helpfulness. "The kitchen staff entrance is through the service lift." His friends laughed again, not hiding their amusement. Malcolm didn't smile. "I know exactly where I'm going," he replied evenly. "Do you?" The man blinked, caught off guard by the calm defiance in Malcolm's voice. Before he could respond, a new figure emerged from around the corner, cutting through the hallway traffic like a shark in open water. Greg Saunders, Director of Strategic Partnerships, exuded entitlement with every step. His hair was slicked back, his jaw clenched with permanent disapproval, and his eyes flicked between Malcolm and the three men. He stopped abruptly when he saw who was standing by the elevator. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, his voice clipped, not curious, challenging. "Name's Malcolm Reed," Malcolm replied. "I'm here for the executive briefing at 9. Greg didn't offer his hand, didn't nod. Instead, he gave Malcolm a slow, deliberate once-over, from the polished shoes to the crisp collar, and finally to the brown skin he had clearly decided didn't belong here. "And who invited you?" Greg asked, tilting his head as if Malcolm had stumbled in from the street. "Was there an event open to the public I wasn't informed about?" One of the suited men behind him chuckled under his breath. Malcolm kept his tone professional. "I was invited by Mr. Carraway's office," he said. "I'm consulting on the Triarch acquisition." At that, Greg's brow arched, and a smirk tugged at one side of his mouth. "Right," he said slowly, clearly unconvinced. "Look," he continued, waving a hand dismissively, "we don't bring in outside consultants without clearance, especially for internal strategy briefings. If you're here about vendor contracts or IT infrastructure, you'll need to check in with facilities on the second floor." "I'm not with facilities," Malcolm said, his voice gaining an edge. "And I'm not a vendor." "You sure about that?" Greg asked, his tone now openly patronizing. "Because I've been running these briefings for the past 5 years, and we don't exactly outsource the thinking part of it to," he trailed off, but the implication hung in the air, thick and ugly. Malcolm didn't flinch. "I think you should check with your chief strategy officer before making assumptions," he said. Greg snorted. "I don't need to check with anyone. I know every name on that guest list, and yours isn't one of them." Behind him, the ginger-haired man muttered, "Maybe he's just shadowing someone, like a trainee or intern." "That would make more sense," Greg agreed with a fake smile. Then, turning back to Malcolm, he added, "But unfortunately, we don't run internship programs through the executive elevator. Company policy." The others laughed again, more freely this time, comfortable in their power, in their assumption that there would be no consequences. Malcolm stared at Greg for a long second, not blinking. "It's always interesting," he said quietly, "how fast some people reveal who they really are." Greg's smile widened, mistaking the comment for resignation. "You know what? Why don't I have someone escort you back down to security?" he offered. "They can help you figure out where you're actually supposed to be." As he reached for his phone to call downstairs, a voice called from across the hall, breaking the rhythm of the scene. "Mr. Reed." A young woman in a tailored blazer hustled out of a side corridor, tablet in hand. "Sorry I'm late. We're ready for you upstairs, conference room 12. Greg froze mid-dial. His face shifted, the color in his cheeks draining by degrees. The woman turned to him with a polite nod. "Greg, this is Mr. Reed. He's been brought on as lead consultant for the Triarch deal. Board-initiated contract." Malcolm didn't say a word. Greg followed, his step stiff, his expression forced into neutrality. But as they reached the elevator doors, he made a final attempt to reassert control. "Before you go upstairs," he said, halting Malcolm with a casual hand, "there's something we should probably address." Malcolm turned slightly, his patience thinning but his composure intact. Greg offered a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Our company maintains a very specific standard when it comes to dress code, especially in high-level executive spaces. Presentation matters here. We set a tone." He paused just long enough to be insulting, then gestured vaguely toward Malcolm's suit. "I'm assuming that's a synthetic blend, full leather detailing?" Malcolm's eyes narrowed just slightly, but he said nothing, letting Greg continue. "We typically recommend wool or full-grain finishes for client-facing roles," Greg added. "Just so you know for future reference. It's a formality, but it reflects on all of us." The young associate shifted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable, but didn't intervene. Malcolm gave a brief nod. "Appreciate the fashion tips," he said flatly. "I'll be sure to consult you next time I get dressed for a boardroom." Greg's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Just trying to help," he replied, then stepped back as the elevator doors opened. "You're cleared now, but next time, maybe check in through the proper channels to avoid confusion." Malcolm didn't respond. He stepped into the elevator without breaking eye contact, and just before the doors slid shut, he said, "The only confusion here is thinking you get to decide who belongs where." Greg stood in the hallway, staring at his reflection in the polished elevator doors as they sealed with a quiet hiss. The hallway fell silent again, except this time, the silence felt heavier, more fragile. As Malcolm ascended toward the 32nd floor, the weight of that exchange lingered not because he was surprised, but because it had played out exactly as he expected. Meanwhile, back in the lobby, Greg turned toward the receptionist, who still hadn't moved. "If anyone asks," he muttered. He got in through a board directive. "No one here approved it." The receptionist gave a small nod, expression neutral. Moments later, the elevator next to Malcolm's opened and another figure emerged. A young white man in his early 20s, blonde hair parted neatly, a messenger bag slung carelessly over his shoulder. He looked unsure of where he was going, but walked with the eager energy of someone freshly hired and desperate to prove themselves. The receptionist brightened as he approached. "Oh hey, you're for the Triarch prep, right? They've been waiting for you upstairs," she said warmly. The young man blinked. "Yeah, intern program I think." "Yep," she chirped. "Go right up, they'll get you seated. No ID check, no delay, no lecture about dress code." His wrinkled shirt and cheap polyester blazer were ignored completely. The difference in treatment couldn't have been clearer. While Malcolm, the lead consultant brought in to advise the board, had been scrutinized, mocked, and nearly barred from entering, this in turn, likely hired through someone's cousin or country club connection, was being welcomed without question. Upstairs, Malcolm had already arrived outside the conference room, where another assistant met him at the door. "They're just finishing setting up," she said with a smile. "We'll bring you in right after opening remarks." So he waited outside the glass wall, able to see the sleek interior. Dark oak paneling, custom leather chairs, digital projectors casting quarterly reports across the far wall. He could also see who was seated: the board, senior leadership, department heads. And now, entering through the opposite door, Greg Saunders, who took a seat near the front without hesitation. Moments later, the door behind Malcolm opened again. The intern who had just come from the lobby stepped in, eyes wide with curiosity, and was waved toward the empty seat beside Greg. "That's one of the new interns," someone whispered to the woman near the head of the table. "Greg brought him in this morning. Smart kid." Malcolm raised an eyebrow slightly. He hadn't been given a seat. No invitation to enter. No introduction. Just silence. The glass between him and the room felt more symbolic than physical now. Behind him, he could still feel the receptionist's earlier stare, her glance over his suit, her unspoken judgment. But what stung more than the delay was the hypocrisy of it all. He had come prepared, had followed every protocol, yet here he was, still waiting, while the unqualified intern had already been welcomed in and seated like an insider. Then, Greg Saunders leaned slightly toward his assistant, Lana, a woman in her early 30s who seemed too sharp to be complicit in nonsense, but not yet brave enough to push back. Greg smirked and whispered just loud enough for Malcolm, still standing behind the glass, to read his lips. "These people," Greg muttered, chuckling under his breath, "think that putting on a tailored suit and carrying a briefcase means they're one of us. It's almost cute." Lana shifted in her seat uncomfortably, glancing toward the door where Malcolm stood. But she didn't say anything. Greg leaned back, fully amused with himself, then took a sip from his coffee with the arrogance of a man convinced of his invincibility. A few seconds later, the door cracked open and the associate from earlier returned. "Mr. Reed," she said quietly, "they're ready for you now." Malcolm nodded once, then stepped inside, the sound of the door clicking behind him cutting through the conference room's polite murmurs like a blade. The room fell into a subtle silence as heads turned. Some eyes were curious, others guarded, and a few carried the same dismissive weight he'd seen so many times before. Greg didn't bother to stand or acknowledge him. "We were just discussing the market volatility projections," Greg said to the room, ignoring Malcolm entirely. "Hopefully our guest can catch up." Malcolm didn't flinch. He stepped forward, set his briefcase on the table with precise control, and opened it to retrieve a single printed page. A formal invitation letter, signed and stamped with the company seal, issued by the previous CEO, Robert Calloway. He held it out toward Greg. "Here's the executive invitation," Malcolm said evenly. "Approved by Calloway and endorsed by the acquisitions committee." Greg didn't reach for it. He just stared at the paper as if it were irrelevant. "That was before my time," he said dismissively. "Calloway's out. I make the call now." Malcolm didn't blink. "Your board still reports to the bylaws he left in place," he replied. "This meeting was scheduled and cleared through legal, finance, and governance." Greg rolled his eyes and stood up slowly, taking the letter as if doing so was beneath him. He gave it a cursory glance, then, without warning, tore the page down the middle with deliberate, theatrical flair. "I don't care who signed this," he said, letting the halves fall to the table. "This is my floor, my meeting, and I decide who gets a seat at the table." Gasps rippled through the room, not dramatic ones, but the quiet, sharp intakes of breath from professionals who had just witnessed something reckless. Even the board members shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging looks of disbelief, others keeping their faces carefully neutral. Greg smiled as if he had just proven a point. Malcolm's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "That was a legally binding document," he said. "You just destroyed official correspondence from your own corporate archives." "And?" Greg asked, smirking. "You gonna sue me for it? Take it up with HR? File a complaint?" He leaned forward slightly, voice dropping into something colder. "You don't belong here, Mr. Reed. And the only reason you're still standing in this room is because no one's bothered to throw you out. Yet." The silence that followed was electric. Malcolm looked around the table, his gaze landing on several members who suddenly found their laptops, coffee cups, or fingernails far more interesting than the conversation. He nodded slowly, taking stock. Then, with calm precision, he bent down, picked up the torn letter, folded it neatly, and slid it back into his briefcase. "Thank you for confirming exactly what kind of culture this company has allowed to fester," he said quietly. Greg laughed under his breath. "Save the speeches. We've got actual work to do." "So do I," Malcolm replied, then turned and walked out of the room without waiting for anyone's permission. Greg, however, remained comfortably seated at the head of the table, adjusting his cufflinks with smug precision, as if tearing up a legally binding document in front of the board had been a routine managerial task. "All right," he said, finally breaking the silence. "Back to the actual business at hand. Let's get the Triarch merger wrapped up before the new guy upstairs thinks we're dragging our feet." The room stirred cautiously, some nodding, others hesitating. Lana didn't speak, but she kept glancing toward the door, the echo of Malcolm's calm resistance still ringing in her ears. Across the table, Victor Halpern, Senior VP of Operations, leaned in toward a colleague and whispered under his breath, "That was a bad look." Greg heard it and responded without lifting his eyes from his tablet. "Relax, Victor," he muttered. "Nobody important saw anything." Victor didn't answer, but the younger analyst beside him shifted in his seat. Greg glanced up, his tone suddenly light and performative. "Look, the truth is, this company has standards. You let people show up unvetted, flaunting some old signature from a retired exec. You open the door to chaos." That guy clearly thought showing up in a department store suit gave him a seat at this table. A quiet discomfort moved around the room, but no one directly opposed him. "Not yet." Greg chuckled, gesturing loosely toward the intern now, typing notes dutifully. "Hell, our intern's more qualified to be here than that guy. At least he knows who's running the room." Laughter followed, hollow and forced. One of the board members, a graying woman named Joanna Green, finally spoke up, her voice controlled but pointed. "Greg, with all due respect, that man was invited here through an executive channel. He wasn't a walk-in." Greg's smile thinned. "And if he was legit, he would have gone through proper orientation, protocol, or God forbid, checked with me first." He leaned back in his chair. Instead, he storms in with a chip on his shoulder and an attitude like we owe him the red carpet. "That's not how things work here." "Unless the new CEO says otherwise," someone added from the far end of the table. Greg's smirk didn't falter. "He won't. Trust me. People like that, they show up loud, flash their resumes around, and expect the world to fall at their feet. Happens all the time." Then he added, as if to cap it off, "Honestly, I thought he was someone from janitorial trying to hand-deliver a complaint. Good tailoring, but not enough to fool anyone who knows what executive presence really looks like." That last comment landed heavily. Victor, now clearly frustrated, leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. "If he was legit, and someone upstairs finds out how you treated him," Greg cut in sharply. "Then what?" he snapped, tone losing its playfulness. "You think I'll get written up for calling out a fake? I protected this room. I did my job. We got deals to close, and I'm not about to let some outsider hijack the agenda because of some old boy signature." Lana finally raised her head, her voice quiet but firm. "But what if he wasn't an outsider?" Greg scoffed. "Then he should have known better than to act like one." There was a pause. No one moved. No one challenged him further. But the air had changed. Something cold and wrong had crept into the space between them. Greg, sensing the unease, stood and clapped his hands once. "All right, let's not get sentimental," he said brightly. "Let's run through the proposal language for Triarch and prep for the Q3 forecast. Time is money, folks." But as he walked to the whiteboard, jotting bullet points and drawing graphs, it became clear that no one was truly focused. Eyes drifted. Pen slowed. Something had shifted irreversibly. It was the kind of knock that didn't demand attention, but still shifted the atmosphere in the room. Lana opened it halfway, stepped in, and leaned toward Greg with a look that was unusually pale for her. She whispered something into his ear, and in that brief moment, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Greg's marker froze mid-sentence, hovering in the air, his confident smirk faltering into something unreadable. "What?" he asked under his breath, the color draining slightly from his face. Lana whispered again, just a few short words this time, but whatever they were, they hit like a punch to the gut. Greg took a single step back from the board, turning his body just enough to shield his reaction from the others, but not enough to hide the sudden rigidity in his posture. His jaw clenched, his breathing shallowed. The Greg Saunders who had been arrogantly mocking Malcolm Reed less than 5 minutes ago now looked like he'd swallowed glass. "You're sure?" he muttered. Lana nodded once, her expression grim. "It's confirmed," she said softly. "He's not just a consultant. He's the guest, appointed directly by the Executive Investment Council. He's their top-tier placement, sent to oversee not just the Triarch deal, but all restructuring initiatives." Greg's throat tightened. "And the board?" he asked. Lana nodded again. "They're in on it. They've already met with him. And he's not reporting to you. He's reporting to Caraway's successor." Greg turned away quickly, trying to conceal the wave of panic threatening to crack through his facade. From the rest of the room, it might have looked like he was just taking a moment to breathe, but for those paying attention, his entire body language had shifted. The room, however, hadn't caught on yet. Most of the board members were still sipping coffee, reviewing documents, or tapping on tablets. Only a few had noticed the sudden tension between Greg and Lana. Then, without warning, the doors to the conference room swung open. Not a knock this time, not a whisper, just the clean, decisive sound of two doors parting with purpose. Every head turned, every conversation stopped, and there he was. Malcolm Reed stepped into the room, no longer waiting to be invited, no longer standing behind glass, no longer just a name someone dared to question. He walked in with the composure of a man who no longer needed to explain himself. His shoulders were squared, his steps were calm. He wasn't here to ask permission. He was here to claim his place. And beside him, flanking his left like a quiet storm, was Eleanor Blackwood, the chairwoman of the Global Investment Board. A woman known throughout the industry for toppling entire companies with a phone call. The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor scanned the room with a single sweep of her sharp gray eyes, then gave a courteous nod toward the head of the table. "Good morning," she said crisply. "I hope we're not interrupting." Her voice was calm, but everyone in the room knew it carried more weight than any title Greg could scrawl under his name. Greg, still frozen near the whiteboard, forced himself to speak. "Chairwoman Blackwood," he said, managing a smile that looked more like a wince. "We weren't expecting." Eleanor raised a hand gently, cutting him off without hostility. "I'm sure you weren't," she said smoothly. "But some things are better delivered in person." She stepped aside and gestured toward Malcolm. "Allow me to properly introduce Mr. Malcolm Reed, who many of you may not have had the privilege of meeting. Malcolm has just been appointed Chief Executive Officer of Callister and Rowe Enterprises, effective immediately. He is here not only to finalize the Triarch acquisition, but also to lead a full executive audit and restructuring of senior management operations." She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The declaration detonated in the room like a silent bomb. Greg stood perfectly still. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. Behind him, the half-finished chart on the whiteboard, complete with his careless projections, now looked absurdly juvenile. Malcolm looked around the room, his gaze calm, his voice steady. "I was told this company needed someone who could step in quickly, assess the internal fractures, and redirect its trajectory before further damage was done." He let the words linger. "So that's what I intend to do." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably in their chair. Another coughed into a fist. Greg finally found his voice. "There's been some confusion," he said quickly. "Mr. Reed and I had a bit of a miscommunication earlier. Totally my fault, of course." Malcolm's gaze met Greg's level and calm, but behind it burned a quiet fire that could not be ignored. "Greg," Malcolm said, his voice smooth but razor-sharp, "you spoke a lot today about who belongs in this room, about who deserves a seat at the table." Greg managed a twitch of a smile, his mouth dry, hands trembling just slightly as he straightened his jacket in a pathetic attempt at regaining composure. "Mr. Reed," he said with a strained laugh, I believe there's been a huge misunderstanding earlier, Malcolm cut him off, not with volume but with precision. "There's no misunderstanding," he said. "You were very clear. You made it perfectly obvious what you think of people like me. The only thing you didn't know was who I am." He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a sleek black folder, and laid it flat on the table. "Allow me to reintroduce myself," he said, flipping it open. "My name is Malcolm Reed. I am the newly appointed CEO of Callister and Rowe's parent firm, Worthington Capital Holdings." He paused, letting the name land. Several board members exchanged stunned looks. One of them audibly whispered, "Worthington owns controlling interest in us." Malcolm continued, "As of last week, I finalized Worthington's $10 million reinvestment into Callister and Rowe. That money kept this company from a forced restructuring. And as part of that investment," he looked directly at Greg, "I was given full oversight authority to assess and restructure any member of your executive team I find to be misaligned with our values." Greg's lips parted, but no sound came out. His eyes flicked toward Eleanor Blackwood, but the chairwoman offered no support. Her arms folded, her expression neutral, but unreadably cold. Malcolm tapped the folder. Inside is the final signed agreement, already cleared through legal and finance. The Triarch deal is complete. The funding is active. The board has been briefed. He gave Greg a small, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And your name, as of this morning, is flagged for performance and conduct review." The blood drained from Greg's face. He tried to laugh again, but it cracked halfway out of his throat. "Malcolm, if I'd known who you were, you'd have shaken my hand." Malcolm interrupted. "Offered me a coffee?" Pulled out a chair instead of calling security. He leaned forward just slightly. "You only value what you recognize. And the moment you didn't, you revealed exactly who you are." Greg looked toward the boardroom table, searching for an ally, but none of the executives made eye contact. Not one. Even Victor, who had earlier questioned Greg's actions, now sat back with arms crossed, his silence saying more than any reprimand. Greg opened his mouth again, this time to grovel, but Malcolm had already turned away, addressing the room. "Let's be clear about what just happened," he said. "This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a reflection of culture, a culture that allows bias to masquerade as professionalism, that excuses arrogance as leadership, that prioritizes hierarchy over humanity." He let the silence settle, like ash. "That ends today." Eleanor finally spoke, her voice crisp. "Mr. Reed's authority, as you all know, supersedes operational command during this transitional phase. You are all expected to cooperate fully with the restructuring audit." She glanced pointedly at Greg. "Effective immediately." He remained standing at the head of the table, the very spot Greg had claimed just moments before, and he surveyed the room with the calm clarity of someone who had not only turned the tide, but had been the one engineering it all along. The faces around the table varied from humble to hollow-eyed, each person slowly realizing that the hierarchy they'd long relied upon to shelter them was no longer in place. Malcolm gave a small nod toward Eleanor Blackwood, who returned it with the faintest approving gesture. Then, turning back to the room, he spoke, not with fury, but with control, not with ego, but with absolute authority. "I've heard enough," he said, his voice steady. "We don't need to go through the rest of this meeting. The Triarch deal is already secured, the financials are in place, and the leadership review has been underway for weeks." He paused, letting the words hit. "I wasn't here to participate in this meeting," he continued, looking directly at Greg. "I was here to observe and decide." A murmur moved through the room, soft but undeniable. Joanna Green shifted in her seat, her brow furrowed. "Decide what exactly?" Malcolm's eyes swept across the table, unapologetic. "Who stays," he said, "and who doesn't?" That statement dropped like a hammer. Even the more senior board members blinked in stunned silence, unsure whether to sit straighter or shrink smaller. Malcolm let it sit for a beat, then added, "This isn't about vendettas. It's about viability, culture, future." He gestured to the large projection screen still displaying charts Greg had scribbled over earlier. "You've all seen the numbers. Callister and Rowe was on the brink last year. And the only reason you're sitting in this room today, getting paychecks, working deals, enjoying quarterly bonuses, is because someone stepped in at the 11th hour to stop the collapse. At the far end of the table, Victor Halpern cleared his throat, leaned forward, and looked around as if to break a silence that had grown too heavy to bear. "I think it's time the rest of you knew," he said, addressing the room, "that someone wasn't just the Worthington Group." He turned to Malcolm. It was him. Another ripple swept across the room. Victor continued, "Malcolm didn't just take this role last week. He's been here, quietly, watching, advising, rebuilding. The $10 million rescue package? It didn't come from a boardroom fund. It came directly from Malcolm's acquisition division at Worthington. He pulled strings, called in favors, restructured debt, and absorbed liabilities, so this company didn't burn to the ground." He looked directly at Greg. "And that happened before you even knew his name." Greg's mouth opened, then closed again. Nothing came out. Malcolm didn't react. He simply turned toward the nearest monitor, picked up the remote, and tapped to a new slide. It displayed a live dashboard, executive performance reviews, departmental turnover rates, legal risk reports, metrics the senior team clearly hadn't expected anyone outside their circle to access. "These files were compiled from 3 months of internal audits," Malcolm said. "Anonymous reports, employee feedback, security footage, every piece of data needed to understand exactly where leadership has failed." The screen shifted to a graph. Greg's name was at the top of it, under a red bar labeled Toxic Risk Index, high. The silence was now a living thing, tense and crawling across the room. "I didn't come here for theater," Malcolm said, "but I also won't hide the truth. This isn't just a shakeup. It's a recalibration. Anyone who has promoted hostility, dismissed talent, or gatekept opportunity will answer for it. Not because I said so, because the numbers say so, because the people you ignored said so." Joanna leaned forward, her voice quiet but resolute. "What happens next?" Malcolm looked around the table. "What happens next is change. Genuine, uncomfortable, necessary change. Some of you will adapt and rise. Others won't." He looked back to Greg, his tone sharper now. "And the ones who've used their titles to step on others will step out of the way. Performance metrics, HR violations, flag complaints, all tied to names, faces, departments." Greg Saunders sat in a near-paralyzed state, his fingers twitching slightly as if still searching for a grip on authority that had already crumbled beneath him. Then, without fanfare, Eleanor Blackwood, the iron voice of the investment board, stood. "Effective immediately," she said with calm authority. "Gregory Saunders is suspended from all duties, pending formal review by corporate ethics and governance. His access to internal systems will be revoked within the hour." She didn't need to raise her voice. The sentence cut clean, professional, and absolute. Greg tried to stand, a half-hearted attempt to salvage pride, but no one offered help. No one met his eyes. His lips moved, a broken whisper of "you can't be serious," but he was already irrelevant. A security protocol notification flashed on the in-room monitor. His ID badge had been flagged for deactivation. One by one, his digital privileges were being erased in real time. Malcolm gave a subtle nod to a man seated near the door, a member of internal compliance. The man rose and approached Greg quietly. "You'll be escorted from a floor now, sir," he said, his tone devoid of malice, but firm enough to leave no room for argument. Greg looked around one last time, hoping to catch a glance of support. But there was none. Lana avoided his eyes. Victor looked away. Even the interns stared at the floor. Alone, Greg picked up his folder, one now irrelevant, and followed the compliance officer out without another word. The door closed behind him with a dull finality. Silence remained, broken only by the low buzz of the projector shifting slides. Malcolm turned back to the room. "For those who sat silent while this culture festered, let me be clear," he said. "Complicity is not a neutral act. From this moment forward, accountability will not be optional." He pulled up a second report, smaller but just as damning. It listed names, not senior executives, but frontline staff. The receptionist, the security guard, The 3 employees who laughed outside the elevator, all tied to formal complaints that had been previously dismissed or resolved informally. "We spoke to everyone involved," Malcolm said. "We reviewed footage. We heard the tone. We read the transcripts. And this company has a choice: to stand by a system that protects ignorance or build one that protects integrity." Eleanor stepped forward again. "The receptionist and security staff in question have already been terminated," she announced. "HR processed their exits this morning. Their conduct did not align with the values of this company or its future." Victor glanced across the table. "You're serious about this?" "I have to be," Malcolm answered. "This isn't about vengeance. This is about protecting the kind of people we want to build with. The kind of culture that doesn't require someone to prove their worth just to be treated with basic dignity." He brought up a final slide, a mandatory training directive. "All management personnel will complete a 3-week leadership ethics program. Anonymous employee evaluations will determine advancement eligibility. Promotions, bonuses, even tenure, they'll be tied to more than just results. They'll be tied to respect." No one challenged him. No one had the ground left to stand on. Back in the lobby, Teresa, the receptionist, stood at her now logged-out terminal. Eyes wide as an HR representative handed her a sealed envelope and quietly informed her of her termination. She tried to speak, to argue that she hadn't done anything technically wrong, but the evidence, ignored greetings, passive-aggressive dismissals, systemic assumptions, spoke louder than her excuses. In the hallway, Kinley, the security guard, was let out a side exit by facilities. He muttered something about just following procedure, but even he couldn't meet the HR rep's eyes. Upstairs, emails were already arriving in inboxes. Review sessions scheduled, evaluations pending, codes of conduct updated. Every executive in that boardroom now knew that power was no longer the shield they thought it was. In the days that followed, the 3 employees who had laughed at Malcolm in the lobby were called into private sessions. They were not fired, but they were forced to face what they had said, word by word. Months passed, and the sharp echoes of that pivotal day at Callister and Rowe softened into corporate memory. But the impact it left was anything but temporary. The building still stood tall in the financial district, its marble floors polished, its boardrooms gleaming with new direction. But the culture inside had shifted irreversibly. Malcolm Reed, now firmly established in his role as CEO, led not just with precision, but with presence. He didn't just sign off on policies, he walked the halls, sat in staff meetings unannounced, and asked tough questions that didn't always have comfortable answers. Promotions began to look different. Names that were once overlooked for being too quiet or too unconventional now began to appear on leadership track reports. In training rooms and mentoring programs, employees saw something they hadn't before, opportunity that wasn't filtered through old assumptions. But perhaps the most unexpected transformation came from the man who had once stood in that boardroom with a smirk and a dismissive tone, now quietly rebuilding himself far from the skyscraper he used to dominate. Greg Saunders disappeared from the corporate spotlight in the weeks following his suspension. The review panel, upon completing its investigation, confirmed multiple violations of ethical conduct, implicit bias, and abuse of authority. He wasn't publicly fired. Malcolm made sure of that. Accountability, he had said, isn't about humiliation. It's about confronting the damage and choosing whether you repair or repeat. Greg was given the chance to resign with dignity, a choice Malcolm insisted upon, not because he owed Greg mercy, but because he believed in the power of redemption. What no one expected was that Greg would take that chance seriously. At first, it was just whispers, former colleagues hearing rumors that Greg had enrolled in a community leadership program in Oakland, that he had volunteered to mentor underprivileged high school seniors on weekends, that he'd shown up unannounced to apology meetings with junior staff he once dismissed. But then, one spring afternoon, a video surfaced online. It wasn't flashy, just a recording from a youth entrepreneurship workshop, handheld and shaky. But there he was, Greg Saunders, standing in front of a group of young Black and Latino students, teaching them how to pitch ideas, how to read investor behavior, how to spot structural disadvantages in funding models and navigate around them. His voice was steady, his demeanor quieter, his confidence tempered by humility. The clip went viral not because of what he taught, but because of what he said at the end. A student had asked, "Why are you doing this now?" And Greg had paused, visibly emotional, before replying, "Because I used to be the reason people like you were overlooked. And now I want to be the reason you get noticed." In a follow-up interview months later with a local news outlet, Greg sat on a modest park bench in a gray jacket, looking 10 years older, but 10 times more human. He didn't try to hide his shame. He owned it. "I was arrogant," he admitted, his voice catching. "I thought power meant never being questioned." But when Malcolm Reed walked into that room, he didn't just change the company. He shattered the mirror I'd been lying to myself through for years. The interviewer asked if he ever spoke to Malcolm again. Greg nodded. He reached out, he said softly. "Not to condemn me, not to gloat, but to ask how I was doing." He told me that if I was serious about changing, I'd have his support. Greg wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his coat. He didn't need to do that, but he did. And that's when I realized I hadn't just been a bad leader. I'd been a weak man. He gave me a second chance to be neither. Back at Callister and Row, that story echoed quietly through cubicles and Slack threads. It wasn't used as a PR stunt. Malcolm made sure of that. It wasn't about celebration. It was about reminder that people can change, that justice doesn't have to end in vengeance, that true leadership doesn't just clean house, it builds one. And on the top floor of that same building where it all began, Malcolm stood at his office window one evening, watching the city lights flicker against the glass. He had changed more than a company. He had changed the conversation. And somewhere across town, in a borrowed classroom with no air conditioning, the man who once tried to erase him was now helping the next Malcolm Reed find their voice. The end. If this story moved you or gave you something to think about, consider subscribing for more powerful narratives like this one. What was the moment that hit you the hardest? Was it the boardroom reveal, the final confrontation, or Greg's redemption? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your perspective.